So first I will be going through some of the main neoliberal myths that mainstream economics perpetuates, and then towards the end I'll be going into how this is relevant to decolonizing economics and the colonial consequences that neoclassical economics brings. So, what is economics and why should we care about it? I'm going to go through this really quickly because there's quite a lot of things to get through. So, if it feels like I'm speeding and you need some clarification on something, do stop me. Economics covers employment, homelessness, poverty, development, the climate crisis, and these are all life or death issues, and we should not be ignoring them, and we shouldn't really let the mainstream economics profession have its way, because as it currently stands, they've been failing us repeatedly, time and time again. There's a definition of economics, the study of allocating scarce resources amongst unlimited wants. Some people have taken issue with such a definition. We don't really have time to go into detail about why, but it's useful to keep a note of that. Why has the mainstream failed us? Because especially since the 70s, we've been seeing higher unemployment. Since the financial crash, we've been seeing underemployment, which means people who are working part-time, but they want more hours, but they cannot get them, or zero-hour contract jobs. There's been a slow recovery in growth after the crash. There's been rising suicide, mental health issues, loneliness, and the graphs basically show what's been going wrong as of late. And especially on climate change, we can see that the more developed nations in the global north have been by far the biggest emitters, and the global south often tends to bear the consequences of that, such as the low-lying lands of Bangladesh being prone to flooding. Sub-Saharan Africa is getting even more extreme in the heat, and it's kind of the fault of developing countries, and we need to rectify that. And here's a graph more specific to the UK, showing just how much unemployment has risen since the Thatcher revolution. But this has also been a trend we've seen in other countries around the world, not just the UK. And this has been related to the strikes we've been having, so we've had a slide on this. Just something to keep in mind. Alright, so let's start with one of the most mainstream diagrams they pretty much teach in every macroeconomics course. It's the circular flow of income. So we've got households and we've got firms. And what do households do? They supply their labor to firms, and firms produce goods and services using household labor, which they give back to households. Now, that's the real events that are happening. Labor producing stuff which is consumed by households. But if you look at the money, households essentially spend money on firms, and firms pay households in wages, rent, interest, and profits. Remember, households are just me, you, but also capitalists, landlords, economic agents basically, and firms are institutions that bring together factors of productions, labor and capital to produce output. So we buy that output using the income we get from wages, rent, profit, and interest. And this goes in a circle, because when we spend on that, they pay us for our labor, and then we spend that money back, and it goes in a circle. Now, there's a problem with this, because you can keep asking the question, where does the money come from? So where do households get the money from? Well, you'll say firms. But where do firms get the money from? Well, you'll say households. But we get this infinite regress, this loop, and that doesn't really make sense. Where did the money come from in the first instance? Now, if you look at the sides of this diagram, you can see what we call injections in purple and leakages in red. Due to this infinite regress, it's a matter of fact but the money must have been spent into existence first in order to circulate around the economy. And the three sources of this are investment, government spending, and exports. And then that money may be used in the form of consumption, where it can be saved, it can be taxed, or it can be spent on imports. So what these injections show you is where money came from in the first instance. And I'm going to go through this a bit quick. So the mainstream neoclassical vision of government finance is that governments must tax money in order to spend money. If it wants to spend more than it taxes, which is a deficit, it must borrow that money from banks, which is a private sector, or the countries. And too much borrowing causes interest rates to shoot up because it depletes private sector funds. And then I put a quote down: the problem with socialism is that eventually you run out of other people's money, famously said by Thatcher. Then of course there's the alternative, where you choose to print money, but that causes hyperinflation, like in Weimar, Venezuela, and Zimbabwe. So this is basically the neoclassical mainstream idea of government finance, and it's all completely and utterly false, because they fail to distinguish the difference between a currency issuer and a currency user. Remember back to the circular flow income diagram I showed. That money had to come somewhere. It can't have just been an infinite regress. It had to have been created into existence. And, well, where does money come from? If I were to make a £5 note and I'll use it to buy something, I'd get arrested for counterfeiting. It's a crime. The government has a sole right to issue the currency. It is the source of money. So then you got to ask yourself the question: if the government is the source of money, why would it need to earn the money from taxes in order to spend? If it just makes the money up, it created the money in the first instance. How can you tax to spend when you haven't created the money yet? You cannot tax what doesn't exist yet. So when the government spends, it creates money, and only after the money has been spent into existence can it really be taxed. It's a point of logic that the currency issuer is not like a household. It doesn't have to earn its income in order to spend. Its spending creates our income for the private sector, because we are currency users. We do not issue our currency. We have to earn the currency to spend it. That's households, firms, and anyone who's not a government, central government. So local governments and state governments also have to earn it from the central government via taxation, via borrowing, etc. So as we can see, austerity has no justification, and we cannot run out of money. There's always enough money because we can always create it. And this is a problem not just amongst the right wing, but also amongst the left wing, because there's been this idea that we need Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk to be our cash cows for social programs. If we can't tax billionaires, we cannot have more NHS spending, we cannot have social security, we can't have this and that. That's false. We do not tax money in order to spend. We spend first. That's the sequence. We spend and then we tax. So if we can't run out of money, then what is the limit? Well, the limit to spending is the real resource limit, because there's only so many real resources that the government can buy. Labor, raw material, capital equipment. Eventually, if you buy everything for sale, the only thing you can do after that, if you buy more, is bid up the price. And that would cause inflation. So inflation is the real resource limit to government spending, not funding, not solvency. There's always enough money. The question is, are there the real resources that we can employ? Right, so if spending creates money, the government simply goes onto your bank account and it marks the number on your bank account up. That's all it does. And when it taxes you, it just deletes money. It marks the number on your bank account down. So as we see, taxation is just a deletion of money. It doesn't raise any revenue. There's no spending taxpayer money. Neither does it borrow money. What you see is that all spending is money printing. There's no such thing as the option of choosing between taxpayer spending or borrowing or money printing. It's all the same. Each act of government spending is just them crediting your bank account. They credit the reserves of your bank, and your bank credits your deposit account. That's all spending that the government does. So when it does an infrastructure project and it pays the workers to build that infrastructure, it just marks the number on the bank account up. And conversely, if they pay the supplier of raw materials to build that infrastructure, they mark his bank account up as well. That's all that happens. They don't collect the money from anywhere, nothing like that. And don't just take my word for it. We got Alan Greenspan, the former head of the Federal Reserve, hardly a progressive left-winger. He is pretty much an Ayn Rand fan, and he admits this. I don't have time today to go and show the video, but what he does is he responds to Senator Paul Ryan from the United States Senate, in a question where he says, well, should we privatize Social Security for solvency? We'll run out of money, so let's privatize it, let people put money in stocks in order to pay for their retirement instead. Well, Greenspan says that this is a bogus claim, basically. There's always enough money. The question is, are the pensioners going to have the real resources available for consumption in the future? But that's the real constraint on spending, not whether there's enough money. Money is not the question. Ben Bernanke says something similar in regards to quantitative easing. So I guess the best analogy for this is a government is just like a scorekeeper. So if there's a football match and I'm keeping track of who scores how many goals, and a team scores a goal, and I award them a point, nobody's going to ask me, where did you get that point from? Did you tax it? Did you borrow that point with interest? Well, no, I just made it up. That's what it is. That's a point, and that's exactly what money is. It's just government points. They make them up, just numbers on an electronic scoreboard. We can never run out of them. As long as we have a dude with a thumb at the central bank, we have all the money we need. So then what is unemployment? The definition of unemployment is when there's people willing and able to work for a wage, but they cannot find work. Wage labor is a distinctly capitalist and monetary phenomenon. Because ask yourself, was there any unemployment in Native American societies or hunter and gatherer societies, even early feudal societies? There was no unemployment because they did not have a monetary system. Because wages are money, and money wasn't really a thing in these societies. So what is money? Money is a government monopoly. It's a government token. The government can make an infinite amount of these tokens. So why do we accept them? Because shouldn't they technically be worthless? We make an infinite amount of them. Why should I use them for transactions? Well, the answer lies in the existence of coercive taxation and financial obligations to the government that guarantees demand for the currency. So let's say a property tax. If you don't pay a property tax, your house gets seized. If you don't pay a fine, you go to jail. Coercive taxation guarantees that people will demand the government's currency to meet those obligations. Because if you have like £100 in your house, you need to earn that money to pay the tax. Otherwise, you go to jail. So that creates demand for money. It's government coercion. It also creates sellers of goods and services, because now you'll be selling goods and services to earn money to pay your taxes. Taxation guarantees that there's demand for money. Money doesn't have value because there's gold backing it. That was a common idea back in the day, but we left the gold standard in the 1930s, and then we left it completely in the 1970s. Gold doesn't give money its value. It's obligations to the government that give money its value. And these obligations are also the birth of monetary capitalism. Capitalism is a monetary system. It cannot exist without government. Government taxation creates demand for money. It creates sellers of goods and services, firms, that hire wage labor to produce output. Capitalism is a government creation. We cannot think of them as two as separate, as much as libertarians would like you to think. Anthropologist David Graeber, in his book Debt the First 5,000 Years, he uses the example of French colonization in Madagascar in 1905. So there was no unemployment in the native population. They used to have this non-monetary system of communal and subsistence living. So when the French came in order to get them to work for the colonial government, they imposed a hut tax payable in French francs. So the people of Madagascar, obviously, they didn't have this currency. So the only way for them to obtain it was to work for the government or to sell to the government in order to obtain francs in exchange for goods and services. And once they obtained the francs, they could pay their tax, and then the hut wouldn't get burned down. But this demand for the currency created unemployment. They weren't unemployed before this. Unemployment is when you're willing to work for a wage in money. It's not when you're willing to volunteer like the British Heart Foundation or cancer research. It's specifically monetary wage labor. And this is how our government provisioned itself. The tax transitions people from the non-government sector to the government sector. Of course, not everyone is always hired in the public sector. In a centrally planned command economy, they'd have 100% public sector. But you could also have like a 50-50 private sector, or you could have a 20. It depends. How big the government sector is just a political choice. So America has it pretty small, I think at like 25%, while France has something like 45%. So once we understand this, we know that a currency issuing government has unlimited capabilities to buy anything for sale in its own currency: land, raw material, capital, equipment, labor. So unemployment is a political choice. There's nothing natural about it. We can always eliminate it. We can always hire any labor for sale. Anyone willing to work can be put to work. They can be hired. There's always enough money for it. So the true cost of employment is not really the wages you're giving people. It's the food and resources that workers can now consume with those wages. You have to look at the real costs of real resources. So I don't know if I have time to go into like what government borrowing actually is, but let's just say there's no such thing. Government borrowing is just the issuance of a bond, and what that does is it drains reserves of banks. They do that to target an interest rate, but yeah, I don't really have time to go into this yet. So what is the national debt then? The national debt is just the total amount of bonds that the government has issued. So every deficit is matched by bond sales to the private sector, and the national debt is just all of them put together. And bonds, you can think of them as just savings account at the central bank. A bank, you or my bank, NatWest or Lloyd's Bank, they have bank accounts at the central bank, and we'd call them a bond account or securities account, and they earn higher interest on that. So whenever the government spends more than it taxes, it issues bonds to so-called pay for it, which is not actually the case. So the national debt is all bonds put together, and they pay interest to people, which I don't think is a good idea, because we're just giving free money to people who already have money. So yeah, that brings us into sectoral accounting, and it looks like a scary graph, but what it basically says is that the government sector's deficit is to the penny the non-government sector's surplus. So when we have austere conservative governments like David Cameron saying that the national debt is going out of control, let's reduce the deficit. What he's saying is let's reduce the deficit of the government sector but increase the deficit of the private sector. Because by definition, the government's liability is our asset, right? Every asset is offset by a liability. So if somebody owes me money, a loan, that's my asset, that's his liability, he owes me. So when the government owes us money in the form of bonds, that's our asset. And if the government, so that only happens if the government spends more than it taxes, then they owe us money, basically. But if they tax more than they spent, they're sucking money out of the private sector, then we have a deficit. And in our case, a deficit would mean we're spending more than we're getting as income from the government. And that would mean naturally that we will increase private sector debt. So essentially, increased government sector debt reduces private sector debt, and reducing government sector debt increases private sector debt. So whenever you hear politicians say, let's reduce the debt, ask them what debt? The private sectors or the government sectors? Because private sector debt is very problematic. And we saw what happened in the lead up to the financial crisis. There was a massive buildup of private sector debt, and we got a crash. Now that's problematic, but government sector debt, that's fine. Governments can never run out of money. They can never default unless they choose to. So their debt is our asset, and it means that we don't have to go into debt. And that is a much better alternative. Contrary to saying that deficits are bad, they're not. They're actually mostly good in most instances. And unfortunately, even left-wing politicians like John McDonnell and James Meadway also fall into this trap of saying that the deficit could get out of hand. And that's sad to see, because it hampers our policy, and reducing the deficit would just mean engineering a recession on purpose. It's a bad idea, and we shouldn't be doing that. And yeah, so the national debt is basically the national savings of the private sector. The government's debt is our savings. So when they say let's reduce the national debt, they're saying let's reduce our national savings. It's not a good idea. And that would be the basics of modern monetary theory. And next I might go into banking really briefly. So yeah, Bank of England admits this is how fiat money works, that we've been having since the 70s. We cannot run out of money, and the MMT description of monetary systems has been corroborated by anthropologists and historians. It's just that the economists have been slow to catch up, academic economists. Central bank senior staffers know this already, but obviously will be the change to make the academic world catch up as well. Right. So, banking. The common idea of banking is that you put your money in a bank and the bank loans out some of that money, like 90%, and then it keeps 10% in reserves in case somebody wants to withdraw money. And they loan out that 90%, that finds itself into another bank account, and they loan out 90% of that, and then you get this money multiplier. The key point here is that you need savings to have investment. That savings creates investment. This is also completely false. In reality, banks create loans out of thin air. So when you create an investment project, let's say you're a firm and you want to build a factory, you take out a loan to build that factory, you pay your workers' wages, you pay the rent of the land that you rented out, and that money finds itself into the bank accounts of somebody else who spends it. So what we see is that your investment decision created somebody else's savings. The mainstream idea is that savings creates investment. This is false. So banks will create that loan out of thin air, which you use to spend into the economy. So we can never run out of money for lending either. So they say, we got to save up more and increase savings so we can have more investment. That's what developing countries need to do. They need to increase their savings. This is wrong. They do not need to increase savings. Savings take money out of the circular flow of income. It creates unemployment. If you want to have investment, banks can already do that, as long as there's a fiat system in place. So investments create savings. And that also means that the government doesn't go and compete for finite money in the banking system. They don't just reduce the pool of savings to spend. This is what the crowding out arguments do, because they say if government borrows from us to spend on their projects, they're crowding out private sector investment. We're going to shoot up interest rates. Well, again, this is completely false. We're not competing for any finite pool of savings. We're just creating the money out of thin air whenever we need it. And this has other implications, such as central bank control of the money supply. They do not control the money supply. This has been a myth that was abandoned pretty much early on, after Milton Friedman popularized it. So they rely on monetary policy to keep full employment and low inflation. But this banking system shows that monetary policy is completely useless. We don't have time to go into the details of that either. And let's quickly go into Keynes' contribution to economics. We call this Mr. Keynes in the classics. So until the 1930s, until the Great Depression hit, we had mainstream neoclassical economics dominate. And what they basically posited was the supply and demand diagrams that we've been seeing so frequently in every textbook. I will go on the labor market version of that supply and demand diagram for sake of brevity. So what we see is we have quantity of labor on the horizontal axis and wages paid on the vertical axis. This is real wages. And then we have an upward sloping supply curve. So as the wage increases, you get a higher and higher quantity of labor supplied. Why is that? Because as you increase the wage, workers are more and more willing to work at the going wage, because the opportunity cost of leisure becomes more expensive. So if the wage is higher, the cost of not working is higher as well, because that's the wage you could have earned. And then we've got a downward sloping demand curve that goes down with wages, because that's the firm's demand for labor. As you increase the wage, firms are going to hire less and less labor because labor is expensive. As you decrease the wage, they're going to hire more and more labor because labor is cheaper. So where supply and demand equal, you get equilibrium. where there's no unemployment. Because let's say you're at wage 1 rather than wage 0, which is at the bottom here. If you're at this wage level, the quantity demanded is different to the quantity supplied. The quantity demanded is far lower because the wage is so high. So far fewer firms are willing to hire you. Yet at Q2, the quantity supplied is far higher because more workers are willing to work at that wage. So if there's this discrepancy between supply and demand, the market will just lower the real wage. So at the lower wage, more firms are willing to hire workers and less workers are willing to work, so we get equilibrium. So if you're unemployed, just offer them a lower wage and they'll hire you. So automatically the market tends towards full employment. Unemployment doesn't exist in this model, and more than that, you basically earn, the wage you earn is what you deserve, because they believe in marginal productivity theory. They say that if you're on your labor demand curve, you're basically getting paid by how productive you are. So if you're earning a low wage, you're probably unproductive. That's the reason you're poor. It's a very rotten way of looking at the world. So when you put something like a minimum wage on, we prevent the wage from adjusting towards equilibrium. Now we have persistent unemployment because there's a wage floor. We can't get lower than that, so firms won't hire workers. This is a very familiar argument we've always been hearing in policy debates about minimum wages. It's completely false. Another idea behind the mainstream is Say's law. It's the idea that supply creates its own demand. Capitalists produce output, which they sell for income, which they use to buy other output. So basically, selling creates income, which creates demand for other products. We produce only to consume. The only reason I sell a pair of boots is to get money which I use to buy a pair of bananas. I just produce so I can consume. It's just constant consumption. That's all we live for. And that leads to the idea that all output is sold and we are always at full capacity. There's no general glut, no overproduction, no cutting back on production, no unemployment. Because if I sell something, I instantly use that money to consume something else. We're always at full employment. Well, the problem with that is, what if income is saved rather than spent? We don't spend all of our income, we save a portion. That's why they invoke loanable funds theory. I'll try to be brief on this because we have some stuff to get through. What we see is we got the same kind of supply and demand diagram, but this time with interest rate. So we get to see the red line, which is the supply of loanable funds. At a higher and higher interest rate, we supply more and more money. They didn't use the term money. They looked at loanable funds in terms of real resources. But I'll use the term money to avoid confusion. So as you increase the interest rate, people supply more money because they get more money out from savings. The reward for delaying consumption is higher, because now if I put money in a bank, I get more money out in the form of interest payments in the future, which I can use to consume even more. Because if I consume now, I'm foregoing the interest I could have earned by consuming in the future. And conversely, with the demand for loanable funds, at a higher and higher interest rate, there's lower and lower demand because it's more expensive to borrow money for investment projects. So when a firm borrows money, it's more likely to do that when the interest rate is low rather than when it's high. And again, we equilibrate where money supply and money demand are equal at this interest rate, which means that the supply of loanable funds, which is savings, equals the demand of loanable funds, which is investment. So savings equals investment. So whenever you save, this flexible interest rate ensures that all your savings are invested. So rather than unspent income creating unemployment, unspent income merely means that capitalists, instead of producing consumption goods, will start producing investment goods. They'll start hiring workers in factories to build capital equipment for future consumption. So instead of creating unemployment, savings just change the composition of employment from consumption sector to investment sector. So then we will introduce you to something called the fallacy of composition, which is something that Keynes highlighted. If anyone studies philosophy, you might have come across this as a pretty famous example. Atoms are invisible, the world is made out of atoms, therefore the wall is invisible. It's very faulty logic, but neoclassical economics employs the same kind of logic. In the labor market, cutting wages makes firms hire more people, and this reduces unemployment, because people are cheaper. Or the paradox of thrift. If everyone saves more, savings in the whole economy increase. This is very, very flawed, and I'll show you why. Wages, Keynes argued, are the incomes of workers. If wages are cut, that will also lead to cuts in spending, because we spend out of our income, which means that less output is sold, thus firms will cut back on production, they will lay off workers, and unemployment becomes worse. So rather than wage cutting reducing unemployment, it may actually make it worse. Cutting wages may actually increase employment, because wages are income. Sure, if one firm cuts wages, it might hire more people because they're cheaper to hire, and demand for its products will be unaffected. But if all firms in the economy do it, then demand for their products will also fall, and then unemployment will rise. So wage cutting would actually be disastrous. Same for savings. The thing is, a proportion of every additional dollar you earn is saved. If people save more, that's less money spent, and one person's spending is another person's income. If I spend at a pound store, that money that I spend goes to the shop owner. He earns that money to pay wages and also to consume. So higher savings means there's less income for people, and this means that people have to draw from their savings in order to meet their needs and wants. So total savings in the economy actually fall if everybody decides to save more. And again, this is when you apply logic at the individual level to the whole level, it doesn't make sense, because the logic at the aggregate level is different. So right, labor demand and labor supply, they're not independent curves, they're actually interdependent. One affects the others. So a fall in wages affects products demands. So supply and demand of labor are interdependent. And equilibrium is indeterminate. We do not know where it is under this neoclassical framework. So Keynes also attacked loanable funds theory, saying that flexible interest rates don't equilibrate supply of savings and demand for savings. These curves are also interdependent, because if investment increases, that simultaneously increases savings. Because, like I said earlier, if you have an investment project and you borrow money to pay the workers on that project, they earn an income. That borrowed money is a worker's income, and they save a portion of that. So that investment creates the savings, rather than the savings creating the investment. And every central bank now admits this. The Bank of England released a report in 2014, the German Bundesbank released a report in 2017, and they go into detail about how the mainstream idea of savings and investment is completely wrong. So Keynes instead proposed liquidity preference, and says that rather the interest rate being the price at which consumers trade current consumption to future consumption, the interest rate just allocates savings from liquid to illiquid forms. So at lower and lower interest rates, you're more likely to hold cash because you're not getting a high return for saving that money. And at higher and higher interest rates, you're more likely to buy a bond or invest in stocks because you get a higher return. Right, so neoclassical economics basically died then in the Great Depression. Keynes killed it. Marx was actually making very similar arguments in the 1800s, but he was unfortunately sidelined and ignored. But Keynes managed to finally put the death knell on it. Unfortunately, in the 1970s, neoclassical economics came back in the form of monetarism, and it's like we abandoned the flat Earth model for the Earth revolving around the sun, but then in the 70s we went back to the flat Earth model. It's a big shame to see this happen in a social science discipline, and we should ensure that neoclassical economics, the next time it dies for good, and we keep it dead. So instead, what Keynes proposed is the D and Z curves to determining employment, and the basic summary of it is that capitalists will hire the amount of labor they think they will need to produce the amount of output they think they can sell at a profit. So if they don't think they'll earn a profit by hiring someone, they won't hire them. So what determines how much profit they earned? Well, the D and Z curves. So you can think of Z as the amount of revenue and proceeds a capitalist would need to employ a given number of people. So it's basically what you need to hire a certain amount of people. The D curve is how much they actually expect to get. So on the left-hand side of the equilibrium point, we can see that the D curve lies above the Z curve, which means that they expect to earn more revenue from hiring a given amount of people than they're actually getting. So they will increase employment all the way until D equals Z, after which they won't increase employment anymore, because what they expect to get is less than what they actually get. Now, there's no reason to assume that this point E here is full employment. This just happens to correspond to where aggregate demand in the economy happens to be. There's no reason to assume this is full employment. So with this framework, we have a new kind of labor market where workers, rather than offering a higher and lower amount of labor supplied at a given wage, they accept the going wage. And there's a long list of unemployed workers willing to work at that wage until the full employment point, at which point we start to see the labor supply curve look more like the neoclassical case. So, as we can see, this diagram shows that involuntary unemployment is the natural state of capitalism. And the only way to fix that is to shift the demand curve for labor to the full employment level, LF on the diagram. Now, how do we do this? Well, through government intervention, fiscal policy and spending, higher investment or exports. And this is how we can fix the unemployment. Now, in this diagram, we see a downward sloping labor demand curve. This is wrong, but the labor supply curve shape is correct. Fortunately, I couldn't find one on Google Images that shows how Keynes actually thought of it, because when Keynes was writing his general theory, he accepted the downward sloping labor demand curve. He only rejected it after he already finished writing it, so he expressed quite a bit of regret on that. But the point still stands. The demand curve has to be shifted towards full employment. It does not automatically go there. We won't have time for this speed round. So yeah, what policy should we be pushing for? A universal job guarantee program is probably the most important policy I can think of, where we give anyone seeking a job a centrally funded but locally administered works program to transition them into the private sector. So the central government would fund it, whilst local government would administer it, or maybe even the third sector like NGOs and charities, because there's always work to be done that's socially useful, and it should be providing a living wage and all the benefits that come along with employment. And it also anchors the price level. It guarantees that inflation is stabilized. So if there's a recession and spending in the economy is low and there's unemployment, people are then hired into the job guarantee program, which pays them wages, which they spend back into the economy. So when the private sector picks back up again, they'll hire those workers out of a job guarantee, so spending falls automatically. So rather than using taxation to combat demand pull inflation, it's an automatic stabilizer program. I'd also advocate for a permanent zero rate interest policy. I don't have time to go into the reasons why, but right now interest rates are kind of very useless. The Bank of England is starting to realize that as well. It does not counter inflation or maintain full employment. We have the money to build council homes and make housing a human right. We should take notes from Finland's housing first policy. They're the only country in the EU where homelessness is actually on the decline. We should definitely take notes from that. We do have the money to pay for such a housing program, and we have the real resources to build those houses. Investment into renewable energy and energy efficiency to achieve net zero by 2050. Absolutely important. I mean, the existence of organized human life is on the line here. We mobilized around 50% of 70% of GDP in World War II. We had the money to combat the Nazis. We have the money to combat climate change. So we should get on that straight away. And also into investment into infrastructure and public transport, get a pure state pension rather than trying to tie people's incomes into the stock market. We don't need more financialization. We should repeal anti-trade union legislation. We should encourage worker cooperatives because they are a much better business model for worker well-being. So then I have this other slide where we go into the colonial aspects of economics. Any questions so far, by the way? No questions? Right. Right, so how does this link to neocolonialism? Well, neocolonialism is the practice of using economic imperialism, globalization, cultural imperialism, and conditional aid to influence a developing country instead of the previous colonial methods of direct military control or indirect political control. And Kwame Nkrumah, in this quote here, summarizes it pretty nicely. So going back to the way I described how sovereign currency issuing governments spend money, here's a diagram showing the different combinations of government and current account balances. So the current account is the external account. It's your account with the rest of the world in regards to exports and imports and the like. So we got on the horizontal axis the fiscal balance, and on the vertical axis the external balance. And the 45-degree diagonal line we have here is the combinations of private sector balances. So anywhere on the 45-degree line, savings equal investment. And the blue area represents sustainable fiscal policy area for currency issuers to pursue full employment objectives. So if we look at the top left box, we got an external deficit and a fiscal surplus. So an external deficit means money is going out of the economy, it's going out of a country to another country, and the fiscal surplus means that the private sector has money sucked out of it by the government. So as we can see, there's a constant drain on the expenditure flows of the private sector, which means the private sector has to take on private debt in order to sustain expenditure levels. This is very unsustainable. On the other hand, on the bottom right box, we see an external surplus and a fiscal deficit, which means there's money coming in from abroad, the external surplus, and there's money coming in from the government sector. So there's money constantly being pumped into the private sector, meaning they do not have to take on debt to sustain expenditure levels. Meaning that if a government spends money, this blue area is where fiscal policy is sustainable. This is the area where we don't see private sector debt building up. It's the area we have, the breathing space we have to sustain full employment. We do not want to do it, we don't want to sustain full employment on private credit. Now, this doesn't quite apply to the Eurozone and also fixed exchange rate regimes. So countries that peg their currency to other foreign currencies or commodities like gold in a gold standard, they are now constrained in terms of their spending ability. Same with nations that use a foreign currency like the Eurozone or the CFA franc in West Africa. See, those West African countries and Central African countries, they do not issue the CFA franc. They get it from the Central Bank of Central Africa. They have to earn the money to spend it. They're not fiscally sovereign anymore. They are currency users. So in the Eurozone, they adopt fiscal rules. They say you can't have a deficit over 3% of GDP, and you can't have a national debt over 60%, I think. So when you have these rules, suddenly your fiscal capabilities are constrained. Now you have to earn the money to spend it, and if you borrow it, interest rates are going to shoot up because you're competing for a finite amount of money that you don't issue. So what happens? Well, we see in this diagram that our fiscal space has been severely slashed because we want to increase the deficit, but we cannot because there's a barrier, a fiscal deficit of less than 3% of GDP. So now that we have this barrier, we cannot pursue a full employment policy anymore because we cannot spend more. It hampers our policy response. So what we see in Eurozone countries like Greece is they want to get out of the Great Recession of the financial crisis, but they cannot because they are not allowed to run large deficits because they have to earn the money to spend it. They're indebted to German and French banks. Same with African countries. All the countries that peg their currencies to a commodity, or countries that have given up their currency and are using the CFA franc, they cannot sustain full employment because they have to earn the money. They can run out of money and they cannot sustain full employment and aggregate demand in the economy. And then there's the issue of foreign currency debt, the IMF. So let's take the Ghanaian cedi. Ghana does not issue dollars. Ghana can make any payment it needs to in debts denominated in Ghanaian cedi. It simply credits the relevant bank accounts. However, it cannot do that with foreign currency. It needs to earn the foreign currency before it can spend it. It has to earn dollars by exporting to the US and borrowing dollars from the US. It has to earn them because we don't, and same with Britain, we don't issue dollars, we don't issue euros. We have to earn euros and dollars by exporting to the rest of the world or earning them in any other way. Those foreign debts are actually problematic. So when we have large foreign debts, that's a problem. We cannot make those payments. We have to earn that money. So what the IMF does, it lends foreign currencies to these developing African countries. But what that does is it comes with structural adjustment requirements. And these invariably are austerity and deregulation. So they say, all right, you've been living beyond your means. You've been getting yourself indebted. Now work for it. Implement austerity measures and then pay back your debts that way. Well, this is complete nonsense because with austerity, as we see, you reduce spending into the economy. You're basically creating a recession. You're destroying your own economy and you're not going to pay anything back at that point. The common idea is of export-led growth. Earn the money from export to pay your debt. But the problem is not every country can be an exporter, right? For every exporter there's an importer. And I write about this here because if I export, somebody else has to import. So we cannot impose export-led growth on every country. If we do that, then every country will try to become competitive and will start cutting wages and costs. And as they start cutting wages and costs, they reduce spending in the economy and they go into a slump. But then they become competitive in exports. So another country sees that and they want to one-up them. So they start cutting wages as well. And these structural adjustment programs, all they end up being is a big race to the bottom, where countries continually destroy their economies in order to be more export competitive, which is just a horrible idea. And it's why we've been seeing African countries so devastated by this. Now the East Asian tiger economies have been winning this game. They've been very competitive. They've been exporting quite a bit. But again, not everybody can be an East Asian tiger because there has to be importers. Right now in the United States and Great Britain, we are massive net importers. And there's a lot of politicians making a big fuss about, how are we going to pay for this? We can't do that forever. It's a bad thing. We have to reduce the trade deficit. Well, think about it. This doesn't really make sense. There's one principle that mainstream economics is actually correct on. Even Milton Friedman made this point, and there's the one thing he wasn't wrong on. It's that imports are a real benefit and exports are a real cost. Because the real wealth of a nation, you have to look at it in real terms. What is the real wealth of a nation? It's everything we produce domestically, plus everything we import, minus everything we export. Because imagine a scenario where we import everything. We get everything from abroad. I mean, that's fantastic. We don't have to work anymore. We're just chilling and everybody does the work for us abroad. Well, think of the converse scenario. What if we export everything to the world rather than importing anything? If we export everything, we all die and starve because that's all real resources leaving our country, and we have nothing left. So this export-led growth means that real resources are drained, and countries have lost sight of what the purpose of exports really is. Exports should be about earning the money to pay for imports. That's what your real terms of trade is all about, the ratio of export prices to import prices, how much imports a country can get per unit of exports. In practical terms, it means that when they push these export-led growth policies on developing countries, what it means is we see a flow of real resources out of indebted nations into the Western world. Yet exports are always portrayed as this virtue. If you look at the Irish potato famine, it was a horrible event with 1 million people dying. Yet we thought they had no food. They actually had plenty of food. There was plenty of beef produced in Ireland to feed the population twice over. But it was all exported to the UK. So what use is any of that beef? They should have had it for themselves. But some crazy economists will look at that and say, yeah, Ireland is doing fantastic, they're exporting, whilst the population there was starving. Because you have to look at the real resources when it comes to trade. And deregulation and austerity. And again, this assumes this classical labor market theory that, if you deregulate, get rid of your minimum wages, you'll have higher employment. And you'll have export competitiveness. You're basically importing demand and you're exporting your unemployment to some other country. Let them have it. This need not be the case. We can always sustain full employment with fiscal policy. We do not need exports to do that. And even a lot of people on the left think that we need to boost our exports, we need to cut back on immigration because immigrants are stealing our jobs. It's just complete nonsense. We can always sustain full employment as long as we are currency issuers, as long as our government is not constrained in a currency union or in a fixed exchange rate system. So yeah, foreign debts, fixed exchange rates and fiscal rules have compromised the economic potential of nations all over the world. The resource extraction of the colonial days still remains, but only in a less overt and a different form. Countries that issue their currencies can always sustain full employment and price stability and high wages. And the international institutions like the IMF and the World Bank need to be reformed and drop structural adjustment programs that have crippled sub-Saharan Africa for decades. Aid should be given in terms of real resources such as green technology and medical supplies. Thank you for listening. And now I'll have a quick word from Quaker.
All right, hi. We're really short on time, but I will try and speed through the kind of politics of decolonize and how we should go about decolonizing in our day and age. I'll say first off, I want to start with a short history of decolonize with Roads Must Fall. If you see what happened with the Roads Must Fall campaign, it immediately progressed into a Fees Must Fall campaign, and it's because the movement couldn't stay in the university. It had to move towards an anti-marketization route. But so first I'll talk about the epistemology of business and economics in schools and how we can also take that outside of universities into a general politics. So if you understand and bear in mind that fees must fall as a natural progress, then you can see our routes. You can see what we need to do. So first, I would say that I like what Abdullah mentioned about the export economies and immigration as a domestic political problem in our country, because what happens is that we tend to see politics as just a domestic issue, and we can't understand the implications of issues on a global level. So first off, there's a guy I follow called Kojo Karam, and I think we should follow him because he has this good take on the current oil and gas price increase. And that if you look at companies like BP, what they originally they were called the Anglo-Iranian Company in the 1960s, and they had a big situation with Mossadegh where the Iranian government sought domestic control over oil companies and their resources, and that direct issue can be linked to the oil inflation that we're seeing, because the same companies and even the CEO of BP, like we said this a month ago, said that the increase in prices have made oil and all these resources a cash machine for their economy and their market. So we need to first see the colonial connection. He calls it boomerang. That's what Koji Karam calls the politics of post-colonialism. So I'm going a bit fast, but I'll say that. So we should first see the domestic politics as important due to the problems that we're facing and the way we deal with politics and how we see immigration, even the liberal context, approach to immigration as a white man's burden rather than almost a post-colonial context, something that's naturally going to happen if we have IMF and all these international companies, international organizations forcing third world countries to privatize and to focus on exporting rather than building infrastructure. So they directly tie what their countries build directly to exporting rather than building the domestic economies. So on the question of epistemology, I'll say that a current case that I don't think people are talking about enough in decolonial circles is the ULSB 16, which is when the University of Leicester School of Business told 16 staff members and professors, very highly, one of them was had been cited into tens of thousands, so that number had been cited that amount of times. They told them that they were at risk of redundancy, and this is because the university wanted to shed critical management scholarship, and their main reason was that they focused on any staff members who use words like critical and accountability and feminism. And that points to the problem in universities now because they're marketized, they're short on cash, and many of them fix this problem by firing staff, creating precarious labor, and the direct the staff who are facing problems are the staff who are critical and the staff who are raising problems in particular industries and sectors. The business sector is obviously marketized, is obviously classical economics. It focuses on one style of politics and so on. So we need to bear that in mind and focus on particular campaigns. So things like feminism in the business and economics sector in school, we can tackle by allying ourselves with a kind of feminist movement in economics. So there was the Journal of Economic Perspectives found that there's only since the 1980s there's been 30% of economists are women, and in America it's 35%. In UK it's about 27% of economists, and it's not changed since the 1980s. And I think it's because economics is a boys' club where they push certain kinds of politics, a certain kind of perspective and epistemology. And so we should focus on particular journals. So Journal for Economic Perspectives is one, and another journal which I think is important is the Critical Perspectives on Accounting, and which is part of the reason why the ULSB 16 were at risk of redundancy, was because they published in the journal Critical Perspectives on Accounting. They literally just they publish the laptop is low. They publish in this journal, so they're at risk of being made redundant. This is like a threat to academic freedom, a threat to freedom of speech, and that's the position we can literally be taking now, and we can take that route and to struggle in the universities. So just first on the route of a new kind of education, and second on the route of academic freedom and power of tenureship, because tenureship is what gives. Oh, we need to charge this laptop. I think it might go off.